Okay, thanks, buddy. All right, welcome to our class on why I believe. We're going to talk about the problem of evil some more tonight. We didn't quite finish on Sunday, and so we're going to look a little bit more at this question tonight as we, and before we go, before we begin Bible class, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll ask Gary Smith, lead us in a word of prayer, please.
Okay, one moment. Father, we're thankful tonight that we can come together and study your word. We pray for guidance as we do study your word and study about how we can demonstrate the validity of your word to others. We pray that you would be with this church and be with all of us as we get through this storm over this evening. And we ask all this in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Gary. Okay, so here, this is just quick review. If you want to make a comment while I'm doing this, that's fine too. So we've got plenty of time. We're not in any hurry. And but I want you to, thought I'd just go through this real quick, these questions. Why is the problem of evil and suffering more than just a philosophical issue? And we pointed out it is the one argument that atheists claims that they claim disproves God. They, all the other arguments they argue against God existence, but they claim this argument on the problem of evil actually disproves God. In other words, if God is all powerful and God is all good, but God doesn't stop evil, then he is not good. And if he's all good and he can't stop it, then he's not all powerful. So that's their sort of argument. But the real truth is that evil is a universal problem. Everyone wonders why bad things happen. And I mean, we wonder, hopefully everybody will get safely through tonight and everything be safe. But we are realists in that we know that tornadoes do happen. They may happen. And when it does happen, we wonder why it has to happen right there. Why does it have to, but it's an intensely practical problem. It's not merely the alienation between two concepts of God and evil, but it's the alienation of a little child and her father when she looks up through her tears and asks, "Why are you letting me hurt so bad?" I just tell you as a parent, and I think most of us as parents all felt this way. It was always the most helpless thing to me when my kids were sick because they couldn't understand that they were going to get over this, or when they had a bad case of the flu, or they couldn't understand that they were going to get over this. And, always made me feel bad that I couldn't help them understand why they were hurting. They weren't able to handle it. So when we think about that, then how can we know we are not alone feeling the pain of life? What does the Bible history show? Well, we have a number of examples of people asking why and how long when it comes to suffering. We have Samson or Gideon in Judges 6, verse 13, the book of Job itself. Job asked several times questions of God, and then Habakkuk 1 and verse 2, how long are you going to put up with this, Lord, from your people who are misbehaving so badly? How long are you going to put up with it? Then Revelation 6 and verse 9, we have those that had already been persecuted and put to death, as John describes what he sees, the souls of those that have been beheaded for the cause of Christ under the throne of God are crying out, how long, O Lord, before you avenge our unjust treatment. And then I like 1 Peter 5, verse 8 and 9, who reminds us that the same sufferings are accomplished in our brethren elsewhere in the world. So we're not alone. We're in good company dealing with all of our problems and issues and so forth. What attributes of God does the problem of evil primarily strike against? How does that make it a real problem? And it strikes against his omnipotence and his goodness. That's where I started a moment ago. Omnipotence is just meaning his all powerfulness, that God is all powerful, and his goodness. When we talk about goodness, I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about goodness in the sense of just being kind and being that sort of thing. You know, when we think about that, kindness is really the will to free the loved one from pain. But sometimes to be good is not to be kind. You want to get rid of a bad toothache? The dentist isn't very kind. I mean, he tries in every way to make it painless. Or surgeons, or athletic trainers, or teachers, or parents, and trying to train their children, teach their children. Sometimes we have to discipline them. And that's, you know, that's not, you know, as Dr. James Dobson said in Raising Kids, pain is a marvelous purifier. So, and he's not talking about abusing kids. He's just talking about punishing them. So if goodness meant only kindness, then a God who tolerated pain in his creatures when he could abolish it would not be all good. And so we think about all that, but the more deeply we love and the more we go beyond mere kindness, we are merely kind to a stranger's children, for instance, but are more demanding to our own. So we are merely kind to animals, but we kill them to prevent pain. And so so we have a higher hope for humans. We hope not just for freedom from pain, but also freedom from vice and ignorance and sin. And God allows suffering and deprives us of the lesser good of pleasure in order to help us toward the greater good of moral and spiritual education. I think that's the point of Hebrews 12 when he quotes from Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, you know, the discipline, the chastening of the Lord, and that sort of thing develops us, helps to educate us. I think the same point is really made in a way in Romans 5. As you look at that early section, the progression of things and you know, faith and patience and steadfastness and all those things. You have James 1, the first couple of verses making the same point. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you fall into diverse temptation, knowing that the trying of your faith worketh patience or endurance, and let patience have its perfect works. That is, let it develop you for what God intended for you to be. Again, there is just a practical side to our suffering that I think is important sometimes. And by suffering, I just mean when bad things happen to us. There is the practical side that says to us, it's not what happens to us that messes us up. It's how we handle it. Everybody suffers. Everybody has challenges. Everybody's had disappointments. Everybody's had heartaches. And I mean, that's not to make us feel better because somebody else did it, but it's just pointing out the reality and the universal nature of sin, of suffering, that it's a universal problem. It's not just localized or limited to some planet or to some place on earth. Okay? So if God is all powerful but allows evil to exist, then he is not all good. And then we go from there to if God is all good but cannot stop evil from existing, then he's not all powerful. So since evil is real, then there is no justification for believing in an all-powerful, all-good God. And that's the atheist argument right there. They think that disproves God. And so because, you know, and so you look at all that and you think, okay, disproving God, then how do they deal with it? How do they deal with evil? How do they talk about evil? Isn't it interesting that evil is what they're worried about? How do they know what is evil? Where does that come from? Goodness doesn't come from evil. In fact, I think Brother Moyer makes that point in the material here somewhere. Good is not measured by evil, but evil is measured by good. So in order to say God has to stop evil, then what are you measuring that against? What is good? Where does that come from? And we come right back to this moral argument for the existence of God, that there has to be some absolute moral absolute there. I want you to turn again, and I touched on this the other day, last Sunday evening, but I really want to hammer this point a little bit more from Romans, the 8th chapter, and help us to understand something. Romans 8 and verse 18, when he begins there, when he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present," excuse me, "for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation," and here's the verse I want you to pay attention to, "for the creation was subjected to futility." Notice the next phrase, "not willingly." What's the futility of creation that happened? What is the futility that he's talking about there?
Evil.
Evil in what happened. That's right. I mean, that's the answer. But how did that come about? Remember, he's talking about for the creation was subjected to evil. How was that? How come? Did God do that?
Yes.
He allowed it, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So, but okay, now we go a little bit further on the same line, same topic. How is it that God allowed it? What is it that happened?
Free choice.
No, how did it happen that this evil happened? Because of man's sin. How come man sinned? Because he has free will. And so all this goes back to free will. This goes back to the fact that we all have free will. And that's how sin came in. And so the atheist never takes into consideration free will. He thinks we're products of our environment, hereditary, and our environment is what he thinks we're controlled by. It's all determined. Not in the Calvinistic sense necessarily that we're determined, because he doesn't believe in God. But he just thinks that everything we do is already predetermined. And yet, if that were true, we would just be mere robots. And what difference would any of this make?
It absolves them of responsibility.
Amen. Accountability, responsibility. I can't help it. I'm just made this way. So yeah, that's right. So we continue. What should we keep in mind about knowledge and why? And this is where we kind of left off, I think, last Sunday evening. So what should we keep in mind about our knowledge and why? I got to back up though a minute while you're thinking about that. I didn't finish my point on Romans 8:20. Sorry. For the creation was subjected to futility, that is to sin, to death. But notice the next phrase says, not willingly. This wasn't God's desire. This wasn't God's will that caused man to sin. But what did he do? But because of him who subjected it, he did it in hope. He gave them hope in spite of their sin. So he says, for the creation was subjected to death, decay, vanity, sin, whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't God's plan. It wasn't willingly. He allowed it to happen, as we said, but it was man who willingly did it. He exercised his free choice. But because of him who subjected it, or him who allowed it, he didn't just leave it there. He gave us hope. He gave us hope. So when John would write in 1 John 3, beginning at verse 1, see what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is, and everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself as he is pure. So hope helps us to work hard at keeping sin out of our, excuse me, keeping sin out of our life. We're God's children. And that's what he's talking about here, the revealing of the sons of God, and that eternal state of being with God. He said, for the present time, we're subjected to this futility, but no more was it by the will of God that it happened, but it was by hope that he's given in spite of our bad choice. So keep that in mind when you read Romans 8 and verse 20. The word futility actually is the same word that's used in the book of Ecclesiastes for vanity, which means transitory, or actually means breath. And so, we've been subject to this futility. I'll have some more to say about that in just a second. So what should we keep in mind about our knowledge and why? Well, we're finite. And so when we talk about God, we're trying to understand the infinite. And so we'll never know everything there is to know about God. If we did, then we would be God. And so we have to remember our own limitations. I think Matthew Conley's brought up Deuteronomy 29:29. What we can know about God is what God has revealed, but the secret things belong unto him. And so there's an inflexible line drawn between what we can know about God and what we cannot. And God drew that line. And he said, what he has revealed belongs to us and to our children forever. But the secret things belong unto God. We couldn't understand everything if we wanted to. And if we could, as I said, we would be God, or we would be completely overwhelmed and out of our mind to try to deal with everything. I mean, we know a lot as a country, we think sometimes, and science knows a lot, we think sometimes, but really, compared to God, what we know today, technology, science, and marvelous things that we do would only fill a thimble compared to what God knows. And it would completely overwhelm us if we could fully wrap our minds around what we don't understand, what we don't know. It would overwhelm us. Yes.
I think sometimes in our quest to understand something, we forget or fail to realize we can't move that line that God has drawn. He made that line, not mankind.
Yeah, we just need to respect it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's not to say that we shouldn't keep looking for discoveries, and that's what Matthew's point. His point is that there are some things out there that just belong to God, and we can't know them. I mean, I think that is the point of what the guys in the last century were talking about when they said the real mark of a spiritual man is his ability to live with some unanswered questions. And the reason they're unanswered is because they belong to God, and we can't know that. So, yeah, Matthew's right about that, as usual. So we got anything else? The issue in Job is who is responsible for the evil that Job suffered. Now we did talk about that. And I think if we were all sitting in a classroom, we would jump up and say, the devil did it. And yet we pointed out in Job 42 and verse 10, the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him, that is, came to Job, all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house, and they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. So, the Bible tells us that the Lord brought it upon him. And I think somebody mentioned last week, though, understandingly, what we mean by that, and that is, who was it? One of our sisters said to us that God limited what Satan could do to him. So in that sense, God allows it in his permissive will, but he was still limited. Satan was still limited in what he could do. And it grows out of, I just don't know of another term to use in Job 1 where God and Satan are having this contest. And God says, well, try my servant Job. He's upright, one that fears God, and so on and so forth. And it's almost a wager they make. And God's putting his faith in Job, and Job, through it all, puts his faith in God, even when he doesn't understand. And that was the point of the test. Job passed it, the devil lost, and it's a reminder to us that the devil's going to lose ultimately everything. We read that. Okay, so how does Job deal with the issue? He said, I'd heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now I know. Job had a greater understanding of God that he could have ever, he couldn't have a greater understanding of God had he not gone through the suffering that he went through. In other words, he emerged from that with a greater appreciation for God than he ever had before. And had he not gone through that horrible ordeal, he would not have had the greater appreciation for God that he now has. And so he deals with it by trusting in God and realizing. We talked about Romans 8, verse 18 through 20 just a second ago. And then this gets back to what Matthew was saying a minute ago. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. I mean, we just have to leave it sometimes. We don't know. It's just a riddle we don't know. But we're confident that God has the answer. That's the big difference. We're confident that he has the answer. Any comments or questions anybody has that they want to make at this point about anything we've said? Okay, what is evil and how can we find a true definition of it? Somebody want to take a stab at it? I mean, what is evil and how can we find a true definition of it?
Bill, to define evil, you have to first define what is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
And
that's exactly.
And that's hard to do without a deity, without God.
Yeah, that goes back to the moral argument for the existence of God, the absolute nature of morality. So, evil is the absence of goodness. So you have to know what goodness is, as darkness is the absence of light. And isn't it interesting that the Bible uses darkness as the metaphor for sin and for ungodliness and worldliness and all that. So darkness is what the absence of light, and Jesus is the light in the life of men. So evil is the absence of goodness that Jesus lived, established, as Luke would say in Acts 10 and verse 38, how that God anointed Jesus of Nazareth, who went about doing good and healing those that were oppressed and so on and so forth. So evil being the absence of goodness, as darkness is the absence of light. And the inevitable product of darkness is perversion. Without light, we're going to living in sin, practicing sin, living in the darkness, the absence of goodness. We're going to be engaged in some kind of moral perversion. That's not sexual all the time. That's just a moral perversion. It comes back to the point of what we've already said. If we're in darkness, we don't believe in evil, we don't believe in God, then why wouldn't we do whatever impulse we wanted to do? Lie, steal, cheat, whatever. There's no accountability is what we're getting at. So darkness leads to perversion. It's the inevitable product of it. Why is there perversion? Because of darkness. It's a product of it. And maybe we should say it better. Inevitable product of darkness is sin. That's all we're meaning by that. Anybody have anything else on this? Or want to? Okay. Excuse me. Now we come to the question of free will. And why is this so important? And how does love fit into this? Why is the issue of free will so important? If you're going to argue with somebody about the problem of evil, I don't know how you're going to successfully do it without talking about free will. And so why is free will so important to it?
Bill, I'd say there's no really good or evil without free will. You have to make a choice in one direction or another.
Okay.
If you're not making a choice, then it's nothingness.
Yeah. Free will. The scriptures show and teach us that free will plays a large role in how evil entered into the world. God said, here's a tree, and you can eat of any tree of the garden except this one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. What's interesting, always struck me about that. Obviously they knew they weren't supposed to do it, right? Because God says, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But then the consequence, for you shall surely die. What had they seen die before? What did they know about death at that point? So what this says to me is, here's the larger issue. It's not just the fact that they ate the fruit. It's the fact that they were openly rebellious against God, whatever the consequences were, whether they understood it or not. So free will is that choice of choosing to obey or choosing to disobey. And as we said, the consequences for disobedience was stated was death. And when they sinned, they had no one to blame but themselves. Even though the serpent played a role in it, he didn't make them do it. He didn't force them into it. He manipulated, lied about it. But still, they knew what God had said. God had made his point very clearly. He wasn't ambiguous when he said, you can eat of any of the tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Whatever that may have meant to them, the consequences for eating of it, they had to know it wasn't going to be good. And they were openly rebelling against God. And so creation itself was brought under futility. Romans 8, verse 20. And death, with all of its attendant sufferings that came with it. There's a great quote in the material by Alvin Plantinga. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good, which I think that's the point Reagan was making a moment ago. You got to choose one way or the other. So free will is linked to the problem of suffering in several ways. somebody said, well, why do men suffer? Well, men suffer obviously by reason of their own choice. Sometimes they make bad decisions. Sometimes they suffer as a result of somebody else's poor choice. Sometimes there may be some suffering tonight as a result of bad weather, natural disasters. I think the point that of all of the reasons that we could give for suffering, all suffering is consequential. It's a consequence of something else. And, whether we're talking about David sinning in Psalms 51, others are affected by the choices that we make. David's family was affected by the choices that he made. Future generations sometimes are affected by the choices that we make and that some make. So the problem of evil extends beyond our own actions and into the lives of others, both now and later. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that they become sharers or that they're sharing in the guilt or the bad choice of others upon whom the consequences of sin come as a result of their own doing. It just means that they're suffering the consequences of it. We don't, if a man comes into your house and beats you up and steals everything that you have, well, you certainly are not a sharer in his guilt, but you are suffering the consequences of his sin. So I'm reading Thomas has made a comment. People make accusations against God in circumstances where they would never tolerate accusation against themselves, or don't call a parent evil when he tells his child who doesn't understand what hot is not to touch the stove. No one would tolerate his own child telling him, Daddy, you are bad because you have this stove here and it burned me. All the child needed to know is don't touch, because no one understands what hot is until after a burn. And I would add that, burning yourself on a hot stove to a child is just one of those things you just do one time for the most part. Janice says immorality, wickedness, and depravity. And I suspect that was why is the issue of free will so important? That we, I'm going to look back here. Yeah, and I think this is what she was talking about. What is evil? Immorality, wickedness, depravity. And that's true. That's exactly. And what is all of that? Those are perversions. Also on the issue, I just happen to think on the issue of free will, which I think is interesting in how we deal with it sometimes, and that is to realize just by word choices and how we use language, they provide the simplest argument for the existence of free will. And by the observation how we use words. Our children, or people who work for us, or people we work with, we praise, we blame, we command them, we counsel them, we exhort and moralize to one another. That's all evidence. I mean, if we're mere robots, why would we praise somebody? Why would we blame somebody? They can't help it. They're just that way. I'm just drawn that way. Roger Rabbit. Man, that was a flashback. Doing these things to be robots, to robots would be absurd. You don't command robots. You don't praise robots. You don't counsel or exhort. So, and we don't hold machines morally responsible for what they do, regardless of how complicated the machines are. If there is no free will, all moral meaning disappears from language and from life. That was the argument in the book, The Abolition of Man, which is my favorite book of C.S. Lewis, in which he argues about this, that, you know, and as we all know, people want to rule out free will because they don't want to be accountable. They don't want to have to answer to anybody. Great comments there, everybody. Anybody got anything else they want to add? So why is the issue of free will so important? Well, somebody's bound to say, I mean, and I've heard people say, well, why didn't God create a world without sin? What would you say to that question?
He did.
All be robots, no free
We
will.
did create a world without sin. We just
I heard somebody say right off the bat, why didn't God create a world without sin?
He did.
Yeah, he did. He did create a world without sin. What happened? Man chose to sin. Yeah. So free will, God risked. You know, when God, you know, and why love fits into all this. Love is a choice. Love is a choice that we make. And God can't command love of a robot. And so but what he wants from us is our love and our adoration and our praise of him. And so, but he wanted us to be able to choose whether or not we're going to do that, to know that it's genuine, to know that it's real. We're not mere automatons or robots, but at the same time, because God gave us free will, as Reagan said a moment ago, we're going to choose one way or the other. Otherwise, there's just nothing. We're going to make choices. So that is true. Anybody have something else on this they want to add? So I have the last point, that love is a choice, and that is true. We choose to love.
Bill,
Yes.
this is Kay Dubos.
Yes.
You know, we were saved by free will. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he chose to die for us.
Great point.
And that's what we're based on.
Great point. Great point. Yeah, and he makes that point to Peter, doesn't he? When he cut off Malchus's ear. Look, I could have called the legion of angels down here, but no, he would. And which tells us also, Kay, that Jesus was not a victim. He was not a victim. He went willingly. He chose to do what he did because he loved us. Yeah, great point. Good point. Anybody have any other thing they want to add to this conversation?
Bill,
Yes, Gary, go.
it's another one of those things, kind of like the discussion of evolutionary forces somehow having an intention, that we can't really even talk sensibly about man apart from free will.
Yeah.
Like, we can try. I think some of us actually have tried, to talk about, take away the idea of culpability or, criminal intent, that sort of thing. Oh, it was just, but we have to assign some other cause. And the discussion usually gets kind of ludicrous because we can't really get around the idea that we have free will.
Yeah. And, the other thing about free will, that what it does for us, I mean, it helps us to understand just how horrible sin really is. That is it wasn't just a matter of eating the fruit, but it was an open rebellion against God. I mean, and when we understand the justice of God, it's connected to his holiness. And because he is holy and righteous, he cannot simply ignore the problem of sin. And so part of our understanding here must be informed as Brother Moyer says, by the horrible nature of sin itself. He quotes from C.S. Lewis, when we merely say that we are bad, the wrath of God seems a barbarous doctrine. As soon as we perceive our badness, it appears inevitable, a mere corollary from God's goodness. And so truly that is so. So in order for God's holiness and justice to mean anything, there must be consequences for sin. Back in 1986, Texas passed the seatbelt law. And I was living in Fort Worth at the time, preaching there at Castleberry. And across the building was a Jack in the Box. And the seatbelt law was passed like in September. And it did not go into effect until January 1st. I think there's 90 days or something like that. So I guess actually passed in October. And so then the 90-day till it went into effect. They could write warning tickets, but they couldn't ticket you for it. So I came into my office one morning. It was probably the second or third day of January. And I saw this girl coming down the street by Jack in the Box. And then all of a sudden, about the time she happened to look out of the rearview mirror, there was a policeman right behind her. And the first thing she did was pull in a Jack in the Box, and she grabbed her seatbelt and put it on. Now, my point is, a week before that, she wouldn't have done anything. But now that there's a penalty attached to it, then it becomes real. And, the law becomes enforced. And so in order for God's holiness and justice to mean anything, there has to be consequences for sin because of the nature of sin itself. Not only is sin a transgression of God's law, which we read 1 John 3 and verse 4, but it is an indictment. It's falling short. It is obliterating the glory of God, if you would. And so we need to see sin as a violation of the very nature and character of God. When you sin, when I sin, when Bill Robinson sins, he's going against the very nature and character of God. And that's why it's so painful when we stop and think about it. And when we find ourselves in that sort of a way. And Romans 3 verse 23 says we've all been there, all done that. And so we're reminded of that, and we'll be reminded of it again in the next lesson, in the lesson that nobody really wants to talk about, but we're going to talk about it because it becomes a problem in the overall issue of the problem of evil or the existence of God, why I believe certain things, and that's the problem of hell. Okay, I haven't looked at my, oops, sorry. I haven't looked at my watch here. Oh my goodness. Well, let me get through question 7. Why is God's justice? Well, I just have 2 minutes. I'm going to stop. I don't want to have to rush through this one. This is too important. So anybody have any questions over anything? I'm going to stop here. Anything they want to add to anything we've said so far tonight? I really intended to get into the next lesson, but.
Hey, Bill, I know it's not about tonight's lesson, but there's it's a book. It's a wrong book, but it's called Love Wins. I think it talks about your lesson tomorrow, how there is no hell, really, how it was written by a whole bunch of Christians in this decade, I believe. But it's called Love Wins, and it is pretty much verbatim what people I talk to in my generation think about the consequences of sin and hell. So, not to read that book because it's not a good book, but it's, it's a very popular book. It was a #1 bestseller for a while. And it's just, I think it's by some guy named Bell, last name is Bell. But,
well, of course, all of that is a tip to reinvent God in terms of our own culture, that he's one of us and that, he loves us so much. And and that sort of thing, that he wouldn't do that. And we're going to talk about all of that when we get into that next lesson, but because it is exactly what you said, what many in this generation believe. Anybody have anything else? All right, I'm going to stop share. I heard the other class start to come in. And see, we're still in March, so it's Roger. If he's in here, he'll be taking over here in just a second.
I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream and recording.